So when it comes to oil painting, there are a lot of things that we can paint on. And there's a lot of opinion out there about what works and what doesn't. So the first thing that I want to do is share with you the major things that artists use today. And then I'll go through each one and tell you the pros and the cons to each of them. I'll share with you what I use. For instance, that's an ABS plastic panel back there. And what a lot of professional oil painters today like to use, and what science says about the best thing to use. So, let's get to that right now. So with all the choices out there, what is the best course to take? And for those on a budget, what can we do when some of these materials are really expensive? Well, don't worry about that, because we will cover all of that in this video. So probably the top thing that professional oil painters like to use today is lead primed linen. This one is one that my dad and I created back in the 80s, probably about 89. And it is still taut as a drum. So it is possible to make these so that they last a long, long time. The problem with lead primed linen is that if we make them ourselves, which is, as you can tell, what we did, it can be very complicated, especially for beginners. The other problem is that lead primer, trying to do that ourselves, is really complicated. The canvas has to be sealed from the primer so that the primer doesn't rot the natural fibers of the canvas. And that requires something like a hide skin glue, what they call rabbit skin glue, or something like GAC 100 to seal off the canvas from the corrosive nature of the lead primer. So then that leaves us with buying the canvas ourselves if we don't want to go through all the process of making them. I purchased a big roll of lead primed linen about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. It's triple lead primed Belgian linen, the best supposedly that we can get on the market, and it costs between $1,500 to $2,000 for that roll of linen. There aren't very many people that want to go through that kind of expense, especially when they're first starting to paint. And then that means I still have to stretch that linen onto stretcher bars, the wooden stretcher bars or aluminum stretcher bars, something like that, in order to get a canvas that we can use for painting on. For many professional artists, that's just part of what we do. But even if we purchase canvases pre-made, most of the time it's really difficult to get a canvas that's nice and tight like a drum. They tend to get wrinkles in the corner, and then they want you to use wooden keys to put into these slots in here, and that's not a good idea either. If the canvas isn't going to stay taut by itself, it's probably not a really well-made canvas. This linen canvas has gone from Montana to Utah to Colorado to Idaho, back to Colorado, here to Indiana. It has gone all over the place from dry to humid climates, and it has always stayed nice and tight. There's no reason why a canvas shouldn't stay tight all the time. If a canvas has to be tightened with keys back here, then there was something that didn't go very well with the stretching process. So with all those complications, it can really be a drawback, especially to oil painters who are just getting started. The other drawback is that in order to put lead priming on a canvas, generally speaking, we have to use toxic solvents, because usually the lead primer requires some kind of solvent in order to get it fluid enough to get it to spread onto our canvas. Since I try to stay away from anything toxic in my studio, in fact, I've been doing that since I was in art school. I've been looking for things that I can do that aren't going to be toxic in nature. Fortunately, for those who love lead and they want to paint on a lead ground, Rublib from Natural Pigments actually makes a lead oil paste ground that doesn't have solvents in it. So there's no fumes, nothing toxic about it. We can apply it to our canvas right here in our studio, and we don't have to worry about ventilation, just like with our regular oil paints. So I love that. I just got this in, just discovered this, so I'm going to try some of this out. But since we're discovering some of the drawbacks to stretched canvas, they also like to use panels. So one of the major drawbacks to stretched canvas is that even when it's tight as a drum, it still has flex to it. And that flex can eventually cause, actually it will eventually cause our paints to crack. Now it might not actually happen in our lifetime. I have some paintings that are over 30 years old that still haven't cracked. In fact, I have a painting, an oil painting from the early days. This was painted in 1985. You can see right down here by my signature. It was painted on linen, but there is not a crack anywhere on here. So yeah, things might crack over time, but it's very likely that it's going to take after our lifetime to do it. But the likelihood is, actually the eventuality is, that the paint is going to crack when it's on a stretched canvas, because the canvas fluctuates with moisture in the air. It swells and contracts at a different rate than oil paint, and the oil paint just can't handle it. The older oil paint gets, the more brittle it becomes. That's the same for acrylic paint as well. The older acrylic paint gets, the more brittle it becomes. Now, why do professionals prefer lead primed linen? Because linen is stronger than canvas, and lead priming is one of the few things that conservators agree on that helps paintings last longer. And it's a beautiful surface to paint on. A lot of artists today are turning to acrylic gesso or acrylic primer. It's actually an acrylic emulsion. It's not really a true gesso, but it's easy enough to just call it gesso. This is probably the most popular thing today with artists, because we're counting not just professional artists, but we're counting everybody who oil paints. Acrylic is the most popular. Why is that? Because it's non-toxic. There are no fumes, it's water washable, it's easy to use, and it dries fast. Lead priming takes a long time to dry. Now this one is formulated so that it dries fairly quickly, within days. But a lot of the traditional lead priming, the stuff that my dad and I used back in the 80s and 90s, it could take up to a year for it to fully dry and be ready to paint on. That's a long time. So that can be a real inconvenience. That's one of the reasons why I started to veer away from the lead priming. Not to mention all the toxic fumes from using turpentine. I would wear a gas mask, literally a respirator, in order to keep from getting affected by all those fumes. So then in the 90s, I read an article by an art conservator who said that acrylic priming was actually superior to lead priming or oil priming. And I thought, what? Okay, that sounds good to me. I'll jump ship. So I started using acrylic gesso for my oil paintings. It was fast, it was easy cleanup, and there was no real preparation. And within a day or two, I could paint on top of it. Now, they have discovered that acrylics don't dry nearly as quickly as they thought. Yeah, they dry fast to the touch, but really there are a lot of chemical reactions happening within acrylic and even within acrylic gesso that take longer than they thought. So, even with acrylic gesso, we should be waiting for days, if not a couple of weeks, before we really paint on top of it. If you are going to use acrylic gesso, which is just fine, if you're going to use it, make sure that you get good stuff. There are some things where we can scrimp, and some areas where we really want to have the best underneath our paints. And when it comes to something like an acrylic gesso or a lead primer, getting good stuff really is worth the extra cost. I know that for some of us, our budgets are pretty tight, but if you can, try to get the best quality that you can possibly get. Things like Daniel Smith, Blick makes a good professional gesso. Utrecht Golden makes a really good acrylic gesso. Get it from a company that has a great reputation for the professional gesso that they make. Now, one of the other things that a lot of artists use is this oil ground on a canvas or on a panel. And the oil ground, it has mineral spirits in it. It is made with solvents, and it tends to be a lot more slick than the lead priming. As far as the surface, it can be really tricky to learn how to paint on an oil ground. So I much prefer the lead ground to the oil. They're both a little bit on the slippery side, but this one much more so than the lead priming. And the oil ground, they haven't found that it's actually a superior thing to put on your panels. So with the solvents and the trickiness of painting on it, I'd probably steer you away from an oil primer like this. So, Baltic Birch Plywood. Yeah, I know, it's not a great painting. This was a plein air study that I did back in about 96, 97, something like that, a creek near our home. And it was painted on 1/2-inch Baltic Birch plywood. Now, in the 90s, when I would get this Baltic Birch, this wood came out of Russia, and it was really well made. So, you can see that even after all of this time, 25 years or so, it is straight as can be. No warping, no cupping, nothing like that. And I have done some really large paintings on Baltic Birch plywood. I used to be able to get a nice big 4x8 foot sheet in the 90s for about $45, something like that. And it was such a nice surface to paint on. And then in about the year 2000, I suddenly got these panels, took them home, and they started to do this sort of thing, the bending and twisting on me. I thought, whoa, what's going on here? I don't want to paint on something that's thousands of dollars and have somebody purchase it only for it to start twisting once they get it home. So I try to be particular about what I paint on. So I went back to the lumberyard and I said, hey, what's up with the wood? He said, yeah, we're getting it from China now, not from Russia. And they were using different resins in the plywood, and the resins they were using were not waterproof. And the stuff was buckling all over the place. So it really was terrible stuff. Nothing against China, but as far as in the 90s, the material that was coming out of there, it was terrible. So I had to find something else to paint on. The other thing about plywoods is that they have a tendency to, with the grain, let's see, the grain right here, they will split. And you can see this little cut right there. Fortunately, nothing has happened on the surface of the painting, but it is a great possibility that you'll get little tiny cracks in the wood, in the veneer, because there's all this stress on that wood, and that will actually crack the painting. It'll just separate the painting. And it's a really heartbreaking thing to see happen. So I would steer away from plywoods altogether. Especially today, the quality of the wood that we get is not even close to what it was 30 years ago or 40 or 50 years ago. And the veneers, we're definitely going to be taking a chance on having them crack on us. So I would stay away from all plywoods if you can. Now, I did try out some other panels like Masonite, or hardboard is something they also call it. I was always a little bit leery of how slick the surface was. And if you try to sand the surface, then you're bringing up all those little fibers, and it just doesn't have the same feeling to it. And it seemed like I was undermining the integrity of the board a little bit, so I didn't feel good about that. And then I had read things about how possibly the oils were leaching out and could cause problems. The oils that they used to make it hard could leach out and cause problems with the oil paintings over time. So I steered away from Masonite or from hardboard like this. But there are a lot of artists that still use it, and there are many artists who have used it for years without any real problems. But then that's all anecdotal as well. I have a lot of paintings that have had no problems with canvas and other things. We're just taking our chances with each one. There is no perfect material to use to paint on. There just isn't. But this is a possibility, and ampersand makes some really good Masonite panels. The other problem with a lot of wood products like this is that they have formaldehyde in them, which leaches out into the air. It's actually fumes. It'll come out into the air that we're breathing right here in our studios. So not a good thing to have lying around our studios. But ampersand says that theirs do not. Their Masonite panels, if you can see back there, their Masonite panels do not have any formaldehyde in them. So I don't know how they make them, but I'll trust them on that. So if you want to purchase panels that you know you can trust, or that are at least more trustworthy, ampersand is a good way to go. This one is a cradled one. I would stay away from anything that's cradled, although this one seems to be holding up really well, but the cradling can actually cause problems down the line. So stay away from anything that's cradled, but their panels seem to be a good option if you want to work on a Masonite panel that's already gessoed, and they have ones that aren't gessoed that you can gesso yourself. If you're going to use Masonite, seems like a good way to go. So when I went back to the hardware store and found out that Baltic Birch was kind of off the playing field, I said, well, what would you suggest I use for oil painting? So the Baltic Birch that I was getting was at a local lumber company. And when I looked around at what else they had, everything had a little bit of warping and cupping to it. And I thought, I'm not going to use any of those. So then I went over to Home Depot, which hadn't been in my area very long. And I talked to them, and they steered me to MDF, which is what we have right here. I love the MDF panels from Home Depot because they are always straight. And this panel right here has been sitting in my studio, not primed at all, not sealed in any way, for several years, and it hasn't warped in any way. That's fantastic, especially with all the moisture we have here in Indiana. The problem with MDF is that it also is made with formaldehyde, and all that formaldehyde is leaking fumes into our studios. I didn't know about that until the last couple of years, so I'm pretty bummed about that. But with any wood panels that we get today, for the most part, that's what we're going to have to deal with. The other problem with something like a medium density fiberboard is that if it gets wet, it swells. and the board is ruined. And if that happens after we've painted on it, that's going to happen to our paintings as well. It's just going to ruin them. And there's nothing we can do to repair it. The other drawback to something like an MDF panel is that basically we have to have a table saw or some kind of a real saw so that we can cut through this. We can't use something like a box cutter to cut through MDF panels. So that's kind of a drawback for a lot of artists who don't have power tools or who live in a small apartment or a student at art school or something like that. MDF panels are a little bit more complicated. Now the really nice thing about MDF panels is that at Home Depot for the 2 foot by 4 foot sheets, you can get them for about $8. So it's really inexpensive. The only problem is we have to cut it into pieces. But $8 for a 2 foot by 4 foot panel, that's pretty cheap. So if you're going to use something like an MDF panel or even a Baltic birch or something like that, I would suggest that you seal off all 6 sides, front, back, and all the sides here, so that no moisture can get to them. And if you want to seal it off so that that formaldehyde is not leaking into your studio, there is something that you can use. This product right here is from Ecos, E-C-O-S, and it used to be called Passivating Primer. Today they call it Air Purifying Primer. And they said that even the Louvre Museum uses this for their walls, for whatever it is that they do there. They use this. Why do they use it? Because this actually seals off and traps in there all those chemicals. The formaldehyde and anything else, all those VOCs, they're trapped. They cannot escape. And this is non-toxic. There are no VOCs from this. So if you're wanting to seal off the panel and keep it from leaching into your studio, then I would suggest something like this. This gallon right here cost me about $110. So it's not inexpensive, but it goes a long way. And you only have to have 1 or 2 coats of it on there in order to seal off your panel. Now the drawback to this as a primer or a ground to oil paint on top of is that this is highly absorbent. If you try to paint on this, you're not going to like it, more than likely, unless you like to paint on matte, very absorbent surfaces, which I don't, because I like my brush to move fluidly across the panel. Once you put this down, I would suggest that you put something else on top of it, either an acrylic gesso or a lead primer. So that brings us to something that I was hoping would completely replace the MDF panels and all that formaldehyde. That is ABS plastic sheets. They generally come in black or white, and that's it. And I get mine from a local plastics company in Indianapolis. But you can buy it online and just have it shipped to your home. So I'll put some links in the blog and in the description so that you'll know where to go for that, if that's something that you're interested in. So why did I turn to ABS plastic? When I first heard about painting on plastic, I thought, yeah, that sounds cheap. Collectors are not going to want to buy a painting that's on plastic. But the person that I heard it from was William Whitaker, one of the top figure painters in the country. He said that he had been painting on ABS plastic for over 20 years because of some chemist friends of his who steered him in that direction. And what he did was he demonstrated why. He took his panel and he just dropped it on this hard tile floor and just threw it down on there and then picked it up and showed the corners, no damage at all. This stuff is super strong and tough, and it's flexible so that it's not brittle, and yet you drop it, nothing dings on here. If you drop an MDF panel or an aluminum panel or anything like that, you're going to ding the corners. But this stuff, you're going to have a hard time doing any damage to these panels. That's a real comfort when it comes to the longevity of our paintings. And so I thought, okay, what's the catch here? And he said, no catch. This stuff is great. And he was selling paintings, tens of thousands of dollars, that he had done on ABS plastic sheets. So I decided I better do some research on that. And the more I researched it, the more I found out that there are no fumes. Nothing leaks into the air. The plastic, they say, will last for hundreds of years without any degradation, as long as it's not out in the sun. Yeah, this stuff does not like the sun. But as oil painters, that doesn't really matter. Yeah, if we're out on location painting and the sun's shining on it, that's not going to be a worry. That's not going to do anything to it. But if we have it sitting in a window or out in the sun for years, yeah, then that's going to start to break it down. But as oil painters, we put it in a frame, it's closed off, it's not going to get sun on it. And once we've painted on it, it's sealed away from the light. So that's really not a concern when it comes to ABS. The other thing that I loved about it is that, okay, it comes with 2 sides. One is kind of a pebbly side right here with a little bit of texture to it. The other is glass. I mean, it's just smooth and mirror-like. That mirror-like finish, we don't want to paint on that because our paint is not going to adhere well to it. It's a mechanical bond. It has to have some kind of tooth to grab into and hold on. So that mirror finish is not a good idea. But all we do is take a little bit of sandpaper and sand off that tooth. Let me show you. This sandpaper is fantastic stuff. It's made by 3M. It's called ProGrade Cubitron 2. I love this sandpaper. I've used so many different types of sandpapers to do my panels and different projects over the years. This stuff is tough as nails. It'll last forever. I bought this box of, what is it? It has 18 sheets in it, and I think this will probably last me my lifetime. Now this one is 60 grit, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that for you. I got the 60 grit because I wanted to test out some textures right into the panel, but you really don't need a 60 grit. 150 or 120 grit is going to be just fine. All you're trying to do is get rid of that glossiness, that shiny surface. Once you get rid of that shiny surface, you can paint directly on the panel. You don't even have to prime it. No gesso required. So generally speaking, I use a palm sander like this to really take off the stuff quickly. Or if I need to do some fine tuning, I use something like this. I like to have something with a handle. This thing clamps down, holds that paper in really well. It's a lot easier than trying to do it with just your hand. And something like this is like 10 to 20 bucks. You can get something like that. It's not real expensive. The other fantastic thing about ABS panels is that you can cut them with a utility knife. It's amazing. All you have to do is score it several times on one end, take the plastic, bend it until it just snaps, and you'll get this beautiful, crisp, clean line. It does take some muscle to do that, but it's a lot better for somebody who doesn't have a table saw. Anyone can get a utility knife and cut through this stuff, as long as you have enough strength to score some plastic. All right, Bill, so what is the drawback to this, right? I just had a conversation with George Hanlon, the founder of Natural Pigments, yesterday. We talked for over an hour on the phone, and I asked him all kinds of questions about these things that I'm trying to figure out, because I've read so many papers. I've read everything that I can find from Mitra, M-I-T-R-A. That's where you can find a lot of the research that's being done today on art materials. I have purchased papers on this stuff. I have read everything that I could, and it still seems like there's a lot of conflicting information out there. So in talking to George, he really studies all this out. He's directly involved in a lot of the research that goes into art materials and what's being discovered about those art materials. So I asked him about ABS plastic because I did see that in the past, he thought that this might turn out to be a really good thing to paint on. So what he said was, yes, pure acrylic panels do look like they might be something to paint on. The problem with a pure acrylic panel is that it's very brittle. If I took an acrylic panel and threw it down on the ground, that same corner probably would have shattered or cracked or something like that. It's tough stuff, but it's still much more brittle than this ABS plastic. The thing about pure acrylic panels is that they don't have plasticizers in there. And it is the plasticizers that are likely to cause problems with our oil paintings down the line. In fact, it sounds like the plasticizers might cause the paint to actually peel off of the panel. So that was a real bummer. That I had not read that anywhere in any of the research that I did on ABS plastic. Nobody talked about that. And he said, it's not a matter of just finding out what plasticizers are in here and then figuring out how to work around those. He said, every manufacturer does something a little bit different, and they don't tell us what they're doing. They don't tell us all the ingredients that they use in here. And they change their formulations on a regular basis. So it's not like we can find out, oh, what plasticizers are they using? Well, will this work or not? The problem is we don't know, and that's where it's a little bit scary. So just like with most of the materials that we use as artists, there are unknown variables and there are possible problems that can come down the line. I'm not just going to throw out all of my ABS plastic. Well, actually, I wouldn't throw it out. It's recyclable, 100% recyclable material. And there are no toxins that come from this stuff. Now, one of the things to remember when you're sanding this stuff, definitely wear a really tight, something that's going to keep all of that dust from you breathing it in. You don't want to breathe in the dust from this. Yeah, the panel itself, once you're just using the panel, it is completely inert. There's nothing toxic about it. if we don't, chew on it or eat it or something. There's nothing toxic about this. But any dust, whether it's from wood or from plastic or anything else, we don't want to breathe that dust into our lungs. Other than that, this stuff is safe. Now, one thing that is a possibility is using a lead ground on top of the ABS plastic sheets, and that might prevent any possible problems with the paint peeling off because we'd have one continuous liner defense on here. But there are no guarantees. The thing that I like about the ABS plastic is that it's so simple to use. I can cut it with a knife. I can even, from the companies that I order it from, have them cut it into pieces for me. I can buy a big 4x8 foot sheet, and when I buy it from my local plastics company, it's about $65 to $70 for a 4 foot by 8 foot sheet. And I can have somebody else cut it into pieces for me. Now, buying it online, I have seen it's about $110, $120 a sheet, depending on what type you get, and then about another $20 to have them cut it into pieces. And depending what size panels you work with, you can get a whole lot of panels for that price. So compared to purchasing panels separately, any kind of panels from an art manufacturer, this is still an economical way to go. All right, so that brings us to aluminum panels. These are becoming increasingly popular among professional oil painters. Why is that? The main reason is because it is dimensionally stable. As far as the fluctuations that it gets from weather are nil. Metal panels have been used for centuries. There are paintings on copper plates all the way back to the 1400s that have actually very little damage to them. The most difficult thing with metal is that it tends to tarnish or oxidize. And so we want to protect our paintings from that. What they're doing with aluminum panels today is that they're pre-oxidizing them. And I don't know exactly how it works. These are not going to continue to oxidize or degrade over time. Because aluminum, once it's in contact with oxygen, it starts to degrade it. And I don't want my paintings, I don't want to have it on a panel where the aluminum's just going to start to degrade and get all these little holes in it. That wouldn't be good for my paintings either. For panels like ACM, that's what they call this, ACM or dye bond. Dye bond is a trademark name for this type of panel. ACM panels, or aluminum panels, they pre-oxidize these panels. Then they put this polyester film on here to protect this side of the panel, and this is what we prime. This is what we gesso in order to paint on. And these panels supposedly will last for hundreds of years without any problems. Unless, of course, we drop our panel when we're bringing it into the studio and we dent one of the corners, which happened to me on a big 18 by 24 inch panel. And that was a real bummer because I had paid over $50 for that panel, and there's not a whole lot you can do with it once you bend a corner like that. Especially if you're selling these paintings in galleries, collectors aren't going to like that too much. So if you paint on aluminum panels, just be very careful that you don't drop it, especially after you've started a painting, because that would be pretty heartbreaking. It can be cut, even just like with the ABS, we can use a regular box cutter to cut aluminum panels. All we do is the same thing. We score it several times because there's two little thin areas of aluminum sandwiched on top of some kind of a plastic in here. But it's a plastic that does not have plasticizers in it. So it's never going to leach out those plasticizers and cause problems with the panel. We score it, and then we do the same thing. We slowly bend it, and then it will just snap. And we have cut our panel. So it doesn't require a table saw or anything else to cut the metal panels, which is a real plus for those who don't have a table saw or who live in a small apartment or something like that. Now these particular panels, these come from natural pigments, and you can get different types of them. This one is one where you can gesso it yourself. It just has the polyester film, but they also have them with, let's see, this is a lead primed linen, and this is an oil primed cotton poly canvas combination. So it's cotton and polyester canvas. A lot of artists are liking that polyester nowadays, but to try to stretch polyester, it's really complicated. The stuff is stiff and it's very difficult to stretch on your own. Much better if you're going to use polyester to get something that's pre-stretched, or to just adhere it to something like a panel. Now if you're going to use something like linen, then you can adhere the linen to a panel, and that's really the best way to do it, because stretching linen, you're still going to have that vibration, that moisture, all of those fluctuations over time, and that's going to eventually cause the paint to crack. Whether it happens in our lifetime or after, it is going to crack. There's no doubt about that. Now on panels, it is possible to paint on a panel and never have the oil paint crack. It is not inevitable that oil paint is going to crack, even hundreds of years down the line, if we paint on something that's very stable, like frescoes. Fresco is where they're painting on a wall. Fresco is probably the best way to paint because it lasts forever and it doesn't have any appreciable degradation. But the next best thing would be something like today, probably an aluminum panel. If we're really concerned about the longevity of our paintings, this is probably the best way to go. Now, if we do go with something like an aluminum panel or an MDF panel or an ABS, and we want our paintings to last for a long, long time, then these are the materials to use. Number one, this is the best thing to use with oil paints, lead primer. And we're talking about a true lead primer. And no, this is not going to be dangerous, as long as you don't eat it. Now, there are a lot of things in this world that are dangerous if we eat them. But as artists, these aren't meant to go in our mouth. They're meant to go on our paintings. There's nothing toxic about this as far as the fumes or anything else like that. If we get it on our skin, it can be washed off. It is not going to leach through our skin or anything like that. And generally speaking, a lot of the materials today, even if we do eat them, like I was reading about cadmium colors, if we eat them, generally speaking, they're not going to get into our bloodstream and go into our brains. That is a myth. They're going to go out of our system, just like most other things that we might eat on accident. There are some things that are poisons, though. We want to stay away from solvents. Solvents are definitely not good to get into our system. Mineral spirits, if we get it on our hands, it's not going to leach through. Turpentine, if we get it in our hands, it's going to leach through. It's going to go right into our bloodstream. And that can actually carry cadmiums and other things like lead into our bloodstream and up into our brain. So that is why we want to stay away from toxic solvents like turpentine. Never use turpentine. It is just not good. It's not good for the paint, and it's not good for our health. It is not good to use in any way, not in mediums, not in primers, not in anything. Stay away from turpentine. It's toxic, and it's not good for you, and it's not good for your paintings. There's really no reason to use turpentine. So watch for mediums or anything like that that have turpentine in them and stay away from it. Sometimes they'll say something like Venetian turp or balsam or something like that. Stay away from all of that stuff. It's all dangerous. Best case scenario is either using a panel and just putting lead primer straight onto it, or adhering a lead primed linen onto the aluminum panel, or we can even use an acrylic gesso on there and be just fine. But when we're talking about plasticizers and the problems that they can cause, that is one of the reasons why we want to avoid cheaper acrylic gessos. Because oftentimes, in order to make those less expensive, they are putting things like plasticizers and other harmful ingredients into that cheap gesso. So yes, it might be cheap, but in the long run, it's actually going to cost us. There are some things that, even when we're on a tight budget, are worth spending a little bit of money on. So what do you do if you have a bunch of canvases, or you have a bunch of MDF panels, or ABS plastic? Use them. There's only so much we can do. Yes, canvases, they are going to crack over time, but often the paintings will still last through our lifetime. Although I have an older painting from the early 90s that had really thick paint all over it, very colorful, and something hit the back of it, and it cracked some of that thick paint. But other than in that spot, the rest of the thick paint on there, it's not cracked. Yes, we might have problems with a lot of these things down the line, but if that's what we have to use, then use it. The main thing is to get out and paint. In the end, if our paintings end up in museums or they need to have a conservator do something for them, that's what the conservators get paid for. And we can leave it up to them. Yeah, I know that's a little bit cavalier to say something like that, but there's only so much we can do as artists. And we don't need to get uptight about it. We really need to do those things that help us to feel the joy in our work. And if we're too uptight about the materials that we're using, it takes some of the joy out of it. My suggestion is to use what you have, use what is available to you, and if your circumstances allow, then use something like an aluminum panel. Either purchasing it yourself and having the pieces cut for you or cutting them yourself, or buying them from somebody like Natural Pigments, who makes really nice quality aluminum panels. And you can get just about anything you want done with them. You can have them lead primed, you can have them oil primed, you can have them acrylic primed, you can get linen, you can get cotton canvas put on them. You can do just about anything that you want with them. So any technique, any style, there's some material that's going to work for you. And in the end, remember, some of the greatest artists today are using all of these materials that we just talked about. So don't think that you have to run out and get some expensive lead oil prime ground or anything else, or that you have to get expensive aluminum panels. Now, if you're really on a budget and you just want to paint, you want to learn how to oil paint, then do it on paper. You can do it directly on paper with nothing there. Now, eventually, it's going to disintegrate that paper, but it's going to take a long, long time to do it. So if you're just looking to go outdoors painting and to do field notes, things like that, you can paint directly on paper. If you can, get something like a watercolor paper, a hard press or a cold press. Hot press means that it's more smooth. Cold press means it's more bumpy, has more texture to it. So get a hot press if you want smoother paper. Get a cold press watercolor paper if you want a little bit more bumpy, and paint on that. If you want it to last even longer, take some acrylic gesso and gesso the paper, and then you can paint on top of that. There are so many ways to do this, even when we're on a tighter budget. The main thing is to just do it. Just get out and have some fun and oil paint. Just use what works for you and have fun with it. And then, as your circumstances allow, start using better and better materials. But really, you just need to have fun with it all. Just enjoy it. Oil painting is a joyful experience, and we shouldn't get too caught up in all of the minutia. It's nice to know about all these things, but don't let it paralyze you or freeze you up or stop you from painting. The main thing is to get out there and paint. So this was intended just to give you an idea of what the latest research is telling us about each of these materials, but not to get too overly concerned with it. Like I said, I have Baltic Birch plywood panels that haven't had any cracking in them, but then there are other people whose paintings that has happened to them. Now, if you want to adhere a linen canvas to an aluminum panel, it can be tricky to find an adhesive that will work well on that polyester film, but Natural Pigments has developed an adhesive that works extremely well to adhere a linen or a cotton canvas to an aluminum panel. So I would suggest, rather than going through all the heartache of trying different glues and not having them work, that you go with something that we know is actually working. If you can afford to get aluminum panels, you can probably afford to get the adhesive that they've developed that works really well with this. And a company like Natural Pigments, George is just a really sincere, honest art materials guy. He's an artist himself, and he's a chemist, and he just loves what he does. He loves the arts, and he just wants to produce materials that are going to work for us. It's the same with Robert Gamblin and many of the others who are involved in the art materials market. They really are sincere about what they're doing. They don't all agree because research doesn't all agree yet, but they are trying to make good quality materials. So if you're debating between student grade and professional grade, just remember the things that we've talked about with all of this, that's what you're getting with student grade. Yes, they might work for you in the short run, but in the long run, they are going to have more problems down the line than the professional quality paints. But what are your circumstances? Use what you've got, and then as you can, work your way up to better quality materials. Now for me, I like the higher quality paints, the professional quality paints, because when I'm painting, they're richer, they're more pigmented, the colors are brighter and more beautiful, and they're easier to work with. They're more fluid and nicer to work with. But if you're used to using student grade materials and they're working for you, then just keep doing that. Don't get uptight about it. But as far as the best recommendation today, it is a lead primed linen on an aluminum panel, or lead primer straight onto an aluminum panel. Now, one important thing to remember about these aluminum panels, if you want to prime them yourself, is that they have to be lightly sanded, because this stuff is still slick. And so like a 150 grit sandpaper, just lightly sand it over it just to take off some of that sheen that's there. And then we can prime directly onto it. As far as actually painting on the surfaces, the difference between an acrylic primer and a lead primer is that the acrylic primer is more porous or more absorbent, and the lead primer allows the paint to slide on there more fluidly than the acrylic primer. Overall, from what we can tell, both of them are safe to paint on. The lead primer is the best thing to paint on as far as how long our paintings are going to last without any problems. So there you go. I know that's a lot of information to try to digest, but just take it in stride. and the main thing is to just have joy in what you're doing. So I hope that is helpful for you and that it answers some of your questions. That is, as far as I can tell, that is the best research information that we have today to go off of. And it might change in another year or 2 years or 5 or 10 years. That might change. But for right now, that's the best information we have about what oil painters should be painting on. So have fun with it and happy painting.